Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for another Discography Dive. And today we are going to be ranking the studio albums by one of the great crooners to ever live, Tony Bennett. Anthony Dominic Benedetto, born the 3rd of August 1926 in New York City, died the 21st of July 2023 in New York City. Born to a family of poor Italian immigrants, Benedetto started his musical career as a singing waiter at the age of 13, eventually moving into the club scene in the New York metropolitan area. His career was interrupted by a brief stint in the U.S. Army, where Benedetto fought in Germany during the final months of World War II, an experience that would scar him and shape his social and political views for the remainder of his life. Benedetto returned to the performing scene after returning home and was eventually discovered by Bob Hope, who encouraged Benedetto to shorten his stage name to the Americanized Tony Bennett. On Hope's recommendation, Bennett signed with Columbia Records in 1950, starting his career recording lush ballads, with Percy Faith handling many of the arrangements. His singing style, inspired in part by Italian bel canto opera singing, translated into ultimately 3 number-1 hits over the next 3 years. And while Bennett would continue recording some of these more traditional pop vocal numbers, his career would also pivot towards straightforward jazz music towards the end of the 1950s, thanks in part to his beginning to work with the jazz pianist Ralph Sharon. Collaborating with numerous major jazz artists, Bennett was an immensely popular live act for much of that era and into the early 60s. His 1962 Carnegie Hall live album was an immensely popular success. His 1962 song, I Left My Heart in San Francisco, initially released as the B-side of another single, became one of his signature tracks, winning multiple Grammys and becoming a mainstay of his live performances for the remainder of his life. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention Bennett's social advocacy during this era. As was the case with many of the singers we've covered on this channel, Bennett was an ardent civil rights activist. He was a close friend of the singer and activist Harry Belafonte and participated in the Selma Montgomery March at Belafonte's behest in 1965. But while the early 60s were a fertile period for Bennett commercially, his commercial prospects dipped significantly in the late 60s, the result of shifting tides in popular music and Bennett clashing with Columbia over the material he was forced to sing as a result. In 1972, Bennett left Columbia to join Verve Records, a union that would in turn be short-lived as he only recorded 2 albums for the label. Interested in re-engaging more properly with jazz-focused material, Bennett formed Improv Records in 1975. For as successful an endeavor as it was musically, however, improv was never a financially viable endeavor, and after it shuttered, Bennett spiraled into a period of financial stress and, on top of that, a debilitating cocaine addiction. After nearly drowning in his bathtub following a cocaine overdose, Bennett went to rehab and placed his son Danny in charge of his financial affairs as well as his management. Danny Bennett's efforts included not only paying off his father's debts, but reuniting him with Ralph Sharon after over 15 years apart, as well as booking gigs for the elder Bennett that exposed his music to younger audiences, including numerous gigs at college venues. The impact on Bennett's career that all of these machinations had was stellar and undeniable. Bennett ended up signing again with Columbia in 1986, a reunion that would maintain for the remainder of his career. This later portion of Bennett's career is heavily defined by him being, in many cases, the last man standing of his generation. By the time of his popular MTV Unplugged appearance in 1994, many of his peers had either died, retired, or were continuing on as shells of their former selves. Bennett's ambassador role for standards music, combined with his still stellar vocals, led to his music being genuinely quite popular among mainstream audiences in the 90s and onwards. Bennett also gained a reputation as a popular and sought-after duets performer during this time, thanks to his sheer talent, certainly, as well as his famously warm, kind personality. There are many testimonials from musicians and other vocalists who worked with Bennett who have attested to him being an extremely encouraging and kind and warm presence in the studio. Among his most famous late career duets are his recordings with Amy Winehouse, which were the last that she would ever make before her tragic passing, and his 2 records with Lady Gaga, who herself would become a major champion and supporter of Bennett in his final years, including helping put on his farewell concert at Radio City Music Hall. The concert took place in 2021, and by this time, the then 95-year-old Bennett was battling Alzheimer's and had trouble remembering specific shows after performing them at this point. But his memory of the songs that made up his musical DNA and that he performed remained mostly intact, and he would continue to sing for pleasure for the remainder of his life. Tony Bennett passed away from complications of Alzheimer's in July 2023 at the age of 96. All right, so Tony Bennett has the largest catalog of studio albums that we have talked about so far on this channel, a whopping 58 studio records to discuss today. There are a couple of his early records that will not be included in this list, 1952's Because of You and 1955's Alone at Last with Tony Bennett. Both of these records are compilations of previously released singles with Columbia, and transparently, while those singles are fine for what they are, they're good, relatively speaking. They are definitely very stale, very stately materials, very button-up for the most part, and you can really hear the kind of traditionalist, operatic sides of Bennett's voice come out. I do like his version of Sing You Sinners from the latter record quite a bit, but ultimately neither of these are career highlights by any stretch. And once he starts veering into the more jazz-focused material, to me, I think things get quite a bit more interesting. Wikipedia lists 1979's The Special Magic of Tony Bennett as a studio album. It really isn't. It's a reissue of Life is Beautiful from a few years earlier with a medley of Cole Porter tracks tacked onto it. I'm not counting it. Additionally, one record that is extremely dubious as far as counting on a list like this is 1962's I Left My Heart in San Francisco. The record is mostly a compilation of singles and songs from previous albums. There's songs from albums that came out 5 years beforehand that are on this record, with only a few new tracks to speak of. Now, don't worry, I am counting it mainly because it is Bennett's most popular album, and if I decided not to count it, I think the people who are interested in this video, half of them would probably leave. But just know that we are really stretching with that inclusion. If it counts as a studio album, it's only barely. As far as live albums go, he has quite a few. The Carnegie Hall one that I mentioned before is quite excellent, but the one that I'm going to highlight as a go-to album is actually the MTV Unplugged concert from 1994. Now, again, we talked about the kind of ambassador role that Tony Bennett sort of took on in this kind of second phase of his career, and nowhere, I think, is that more evident than this MTV Unplugged show. I mean, he's performing in front of a fairly young audience, as, you know, most MTV Unplugged shows are, and he's playing with, you know, the players and the trio that accompanied him on a lot of his great, like, 90s records, and it's stellar, and it's so interesting to see him kind of take you on this journey through the history of, you know, standards music and jazz music and stuff like that, and do so in such a charismatic way. His vocals are brilliant for a guy who is in his mid, you know, almost 70 years old at that point. And the moment in the middle, which is something I think he did in a lot of his live performances, where he sings Fly Me to the Moon completely unamplified, like he has, you know, them turn off his vocal microphone, so he's only singing into like the, you know, the stage microphones or like the audience mic, and it shows you just how much he can project his voice, and it's unreal. So it's incredibly entertaining. It's incredibly representative, I think, and emblematic of this late phase of his career and the strengths of it, and why, even though Bennett was a very popular artist in the 1960s, that in many ways some of his greatest impact really was from the 90s and onwards, when he becomes this sort of advocate for this music and these types of players and things like that. So the MTV Unplugged concert is really, really worth checking out. Highly recommend it. But all right, we have 58 studio albums to get through here, so this is going to take a little while. Sit back, grab a drink, do what you need to do, and let's strap in. At the bottom, at number 58, and I really wasn't expecting to actively dislike a Tony Bennett record, but it has happened. There is at least one record that I think is outright bad, and that is 1970s. Tony Bennett sings the great hits of today. And I don't feel bad saying that because Tony himself would have agreed with me. You know, we talk about, you know, in the late 60s, after the British invasion, after it's clear that, you know, rock music is going to become the dominant form of popular music, you have all these standards artists and traditional pop artists making the pivot to recording more rock centric material, or at least more contemporary material, the type of stuff that Dean Martin kind of had the jump on. You know, Andy Williams as well. You have, you know, Sinatra starts recording stuff. Even Bing Crosby is recording like Beatles songs and stuff by the end of the 60s. And Tony Bennett, in many ways, is one of the last people standing. You know, his late 60s records from pretty much across the board just don't have contemporary songs on them. It is standard stuff. And there's a reason for that, which is that Bennett famously hated a lot of more contemporary popular music and hated rock music and that sort of thing. And so when Columbia finally gets to him and says, hey, like, you're not selling records, you need to record a contemporary record, this is what you get. Bennett himself has stated that this has actually been cited by multiple people, that Bennett vomited on the first day of recording because he had this feeling of dread to as far as like recording the material. It fucking shows. This is a record made by someone who can't stand what he's singing. There's no joy here. Even for as technically good as it is, I still would not accuse this of being poorly sung. It's just done with a complete lack of interest, and even contempt at points. It doesn't help that I think the arrangements are sort of hack jobs. You know, there's a couple Beatles songs on here. Here, There, and Everywhere, they turn into this like mid-tempo swing number, which does not work at all. I don't know what the thought process was. Whoever decided to have Bennett recite the verses of Eleanor Rigby in spoken word form probably deserved a raise, not because it's good, it's horrible, but because it's hilarious at the same time. There's no joy in here. It would have been a rush job anyways. It would not have been a highlight whatsoever, but some of these early 70s records are pretty rough, and this is definitely the nadir of the bunch. Tony sings the great hits of today, 1970. It's the number 58. It's pretty bad. Do not recommend it at all. Number 57, I have 1972's Summer of 42. Yeah, the early 70s is going to get kind of rocked in this list because this is really the period where things just are really rough. This is another collection of pop songs. Like some of his other early 70s stuff, this is actually a collection of outtakes from other sessions. There's even one song on here that dates all the way back from 1959. Just not crazy about this. Not very keen on the track It Was Me on here. The whole thing is based off of like, I think the film Summer of 42 that came out around that time. So that's kind of the theme. I mean, these aren't all songs from 1942 as far as I'm aware, but, you know, just again, another collection of contemporary pop songs. Even the ballads here have this very dreary tone to them. Songs like Somewhere Along the Line still are just missing a sense of vitality here. The line about Napoleon Bonaparte on that track comes across real awkward with Bennett delivering it. There's just nothing here really to cling on to. It exists. Bennett doesn't seem to be enjoying it very much. And yeah, I have nothing to recommend from this one. Summer 42, my number 57. Number 56, I have 1970s Tony Bennett's Something. This is an improvement on Great Hits of Today, which is the record before it, which is not saying that much, but I do think the arrangements here by Peter Matz are significantly better. And I think the material is closer to what Bennett's strengths are, less so. I mean, they do have a couple Beatles covers on here, including Something, which was on the previous record too, but never mind. But a lot of these tracks here are a little bit closer to like Bacharach as opposed to like MacArthur Park or something like that. On a Clear Day, You Can See Forever. I think that one's excellent. Definitely a highlight on the record here. Still don't think this is up to the stuff of even the average record from this era. Bennett, um, his voice in this period is also starting to get this kind of like husky tone to it, which prevents it from reaching the heights of recent material. It's still not bad, but tracks like the song Yellow Days on here, his voice is kind of odd sounding. It becomes really noticeable. Still pleasant enough, but it's, again, overall, I think this record still does have a lot of the same issues that most of his early 70s material has, and doesn't really stand out in any meaningful way. Far from essential. Tony Bennett Something, my number 56. Number 55, I have 1973's Listen Easy. One of two records that Bennett put out on Verve, and this is easily the weaker of the two. Again, a collection of very just like melodramatic numbers with Bennett's vocals not being superb necessarily. If I Could Go Back is a very theatrical track, and I think that song is interesting because it's one of the first times in his entire career where I genuinely feel like the song demands more than what Bennett can give it vocally. He certainly tries to shout his way through it, but it's not the most elegant performance from him. The numbers on here that are arranged by Don Costa, I think, are better. But still, overall, it's one of his weakest efforts. And then you get to the final track. The final track, Tell Her It's Snowing, which was kind of the single from the record. Stellar recording. Hits you like a truck. I mean, just a phenomenal performance from Bennett. Perfect arrangement. Highlight of the 70s and of this entire period of his career. You're not expecting it at all. It's absolutely on another plane compared to everything else on this album. So yeah, I would highly recommend that song. And if it wasn't for that track, this thing would be a lot closer to the bottom of the list than it is here. But yeah, overall, you have the one takeaway. I don't think anything else here is really worth listening to, though. Listen Easy, my number 55. Number 54, I have 1971's Love Story. Much like Summer of 42, quite a few of these tracks were ones he had recorded already in the 50s and 60s. And certainly some of these are literally those recordings, like I think Tea for Two and A Taste of Honey, if I'm not mistaken, are original recordings of his. And so as a result, this just kind of feels like an imitation of other albums that he put out, and also kind of like an outtakes collection. It's kind of the worst of both worlds. Again, from a vocal standpoint, not terrific. I don't care for the vocal affect he's using on the track I Want to Be Happy here. It's not offensively poor in the way that some of these other albums have, or that some of these other albums are, but it's, again, it just kind of, it exists. It feels extremely inessential. And it's no surprise that between this record and Summer of 42, these end up being the, two of his last affairs with Columbia. The well is really drying up here. Love Story comes in at number 54. Number 53, and we are out of the early 70s for the first time, thankfully. I have 2012's Viva Duets. One of three just straight up duets themed records that Bennett put out. The appeal here compared to the others is that these songs are written and performed with Latin and Spanish/Portuguese speaking singers. Now, the interesting piece of this is that there's no actual samba or bossa nova included in this material at all, despite Bennett having experience recording in both of these genres. These are just kind of traditional tracks, The Way You Look Tonight, For Once in My Life, I Want to Be Around, traditional songs that happen to have Latin musicians collaborating with him. This doesn't have the highlights of the first two by any means. It is my least favorite of those three duets records. But compared to everything else we've talked about, I think the floor here is still pretty high from a quality standpoint. And I think there's no collaborations here that strike me as especially poor. It just kind of, it doesn't feel like a superb mixture of singers and material, maybe. It is the shortest of the three duets records, though, which does help its argument. So Viva Duets, not great, but definitely not poor either. It kind of exists, and it's my number 53. Number 52, I have 1968's Yesterday I Heard the Rain. It's fine, but this is a record where I don't understand the sequencing decisions here. No idea at all why this thing starts with five extremely slow and sedate numbers. I mean, I was thinking this record was going to be a ballads number based off of how it sounds. And then it gets to Get Happy, which is a super upbeat number, and that's right at the end of the first side. So I'm not entirely sure what the logic was there. Also, why is the track Hi Ho almost 5 minutes long? You tell me. I don't really know. I think his voice is really great on here, but the material is not present. And I don't think I think the sequencing makes it feel like a longer record than it is also, which doesn't really help. It's another fairly anonymous product when all's said and done, from this late 60s era. Yesterday I Heard the Rain, my number 52. At number 51, I have 2006's Duets, an American Classic, the first of the Duets records. You want to talk about star-studded affairs? I mean, this record is not just pulling out like your Barbra Streisands and your Diana Kralls, people who you would expect would record this type of material, but like Paul McCartney's on here, Elton John, Sting is on here, and even a couple of notable names from the country scene, like the Chicks are on here, and Tim McGraw is on here. Believe it or not, I think Tim McGraw's collaboration on Cold Cold Heart is actually quite nice. I really like how he fits into the mold there. I don't know, maybe 10 years earlier, in like the early to mid 90s, I think this would have been dynamite, but at this point, you know, Bennett is 80 at this point, and he's starting to show his age. And the mixture of performance to material just doesn't necessarily work well. Again, I like the Tim McGraw one okay. I think the McCartney one and The Very Thought of You is pretty nice. Stevie Wonder, of course, on For Once in My Life that works perfectly. But the Elton John duet on Rags to Riches doesn't work for me. Sting's diction on The Boulevard of Broken Dreams is really strange. Wasn't super into that one. Not sure about the Elvis Costello duet either. I don't know. It's a mixed bag. It's also quite long. It's over an hour in length, and just not necessarily enough quality to justify all of that. Individual moments that I enjoy a decent bit, but as a whole affair, I don't know. Again, I find myself almost wishing that this would have happened at least a few years earlier than it did. Duets, an American Classic, my number 51. Number 50, I have 1960's Alone Together. This is one of a couple of records that Bennett did with the arranger Frank Duvall in this era. You know, I had issues with Frank Duvall in the Ella Fitzgerald video, where I thought a lot of his arrangements were very kind of almost stuffy sounding, and this one certainly fits the bill. You have a bunch of ballads on here that I think hit these same notes of kind of sweeping strings and soprano backing vocals, and it all kind of blends together and doesn't necessarily evoke much emotion inside of me. The track Gone with the Wind, I think, is a pretty solid example of that, where it's very kind of elaborate and ornate, and I just don't necessarily connect with it on much of a level. I do like How Long Has This Been Going On? I really like the kind of restrained vocal that Bennett delivers here. There's nice moments on it, but as far as kind of ballad performances go, I think Bennett has better at his disposal. So Alone Together from 1960 comes in at my number 50. At number 49, I have 1998's Tony Bennett, The Playground. As the name and perhaps the album cover suggests, this is Bennett doing not a collection of children's songs per se, but it is clearly material intended to be listened to for children in this presentation. And it is nice for what it is. I think there are a couple of moments. I think the duet with Elmo on the track Little Things is a little bit rough. And the Rosie O'Donnell duet on Put on a Happy Face is only slightly better. And it's not really Rosie's fault. It's mostly kind of the kids' chorus that they have kind of jumping in and out of that one. Not superb. But for the most part, it's a pretty nice collection of standards where Bennett plays up his kind of jovial side quite a bit. I do think that the moments with like Kermit the Frog in the middle are quite pleasant. And yeah, I think again, this leads into kind of the more jovial, kinder side of Bennett, which is always a plus. So I do think this record works in whole, even if, you know, if you're listening to it with your kiddos, there are probably a couple of moments where you might wince just a tiny bit. The Playground, my number 49. Number 48, I have 2011's Duets 2. Amazingly, this is the first number one album of Bennett's career. In this case, really the product of the Amy Winehouse collaboration on Here, Body and Soul, the last recording that she would ever make. And incidentally, if you want, again, more of an example of how effective of a duets partner Bennett was and how much people enjoyed working with him, watch some of the kind of behind the scenes footage and hear the interviews about people talking about how Bennett worked with Winehouse around this time. She's clearly struggling, and even in the final version, I don't think she sounds great, but Bennett is there kind of coaching her and encouraging her and trying to advocate for her when like the producer tries to step in. Just a really like nice, genuinely kind moment that really speaks, I think, to his character. Quite a few returning faces for this record overall, plus a few new ones. Aretha Franklin comes in, Mariah Carey comes in, Willie Nelson, and even more. And I think the reason why Duets 2 works better than the other two is I think the cover selection is more suited for Bennett and his collaborators here. They're leaning into a little bit more of the classical aesthetic, I suppose, or the more kind of the grander aesthetic rather than the up-tempo swing numbers as much. And I think the collaborators fit that a bit better here. This also, of course, has the Lady Gaga collaboration, The Lady is a Tramp, which is definitely one of the highlights here and will ultimately spawn the Gaga duet records later on. It's still on the longer side, which is a little bit of a strike against it for me. But definitely of these duets records, I think this one is the most successful at what it's trying to do. So Duets 2 comes in at my number 48. At number 47, I have 1972's With Love. This is Bennett's last record with Columbia until his comeback with the label in the mid-80s. And ironically, it's actually his best record in several years up to that point. Robert Farnon is on the arrangements here. Really like a lot of the stuff that Farnon does with Bennett overall. And while this is still kind of sedate, like his other early 70s records are, there's definitely a bit more life to this one, and it's back to kind of standards material rather than contemporary stuff, which works. I think it also contains two of the best just pure swing arrangements he's done in a long time. The opening track, The Riviera, I think is great. I think Love, a little bit later on, is even better. Yeah, it's not a great album start to finish, but there's at least moments of life. There's still a spark, and I think you hear this spark translate into what he will ultimately do on Verve and Improv later on in the decade. So even if it's not sustained across the whole thing, and even if I wouldn't necessarily recommend this record, it still has something to offer, which is more than can be said for a lot of his other stuff from the period. With Love, my number 47. Number 46, I have 1966's A Time for Love. This record is kind of a compilation of unreleased tracks going from as far back as 1960. And, you know, it's nice for what it is. I think the track Yesterday's on here has a really interesting juxtaposition of like faster and slower sections. There's even instrumental solos on there, which is interesting. Almost feels like Bennett takes a back seat on this record compared to everyone else, or on that track anyways. I do also like his version of In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning here as well. That's quite nice. It's a bit all over the place. It's a bit disjointed, as many of these kind of, you know, pseudo compilation type things are. But it's still a compilation of some really, you know, a really strong era of his career. So, you know, as far as outtakes go, you could do a lot worse than the material from this period. So A Time for Love comes in at my number 46. Not bad. Fairly decent at this point. At number 45, I have 1963's This Is All I Ask. Ralph Burns on the arrangements of this one. Not one of the stronger records from this period of Bennett's career. It feels very slight for the most part, but it is enjoyable for what it is. The track True Blue Lou is kind of interesting. It has this kind of hiccuping motif in the backing vocals that Bennett even leans into himself at one point, which is a bit odd. The Way That I Feel on here is a very kind of white take on the blues that Bennett does a fair enough job making sound okay. He dips into blues music a little bit over at different points and has varying levels of success with it. This Is All I Ask is nice. I think, again, it's pleasant for what it is. It's not essential. But again, it's it's at a period of his career where the floor is pretty high. So even if this is one of the lesser records from this era, it's still nice for what it is. This Is All I Ask comes in at my number 45. At number 44, I have 2004's The Art of Romance. This is the last record of his to be a true solo project. Everything else after this is either a duets record, as marketed as a duets record, or is a collaborative affair that's co-credited to someone else. Fairly inessential for the most part. It doesn't reach the heights of his 90s work, but it is at least fairly consistent kind of ballads and the occasional up-tempo number. Being Alive, I like quite a bit. I think that's a really nice rendition of the Sondheim track. Again, I would not rate it highly compared to the material that he was producing before it. But I think it's a solid, unremarkable, inoffensive affair. And it's also one of his shorter records from this period, which I think does count as a plus as well. So The Art of Romance comes in at my number 44. Decent, if unremarkable, record. At number 43, I have 1969's I've Gotta Be Me. I like the arrangements on this one quite a bit. Peter Matz and Tori Zito on the arrangements on this one. I'm not sure that I love the vocal production, though. And this is kind of a problem I have with a lot of these kind of Bennett records from this era. His voice is drowned in reverb to try to make it sound massive. And I think the problem is, which is exemplified here, is that it clashes with the orchestra. It feels like his voice is washed out as opposed to sounding kind of massive and reverberant. That doesn't mean there aren't still some very kind of strong moments here. I do like the title track a good bit. Played Against Sam is nice. I like the rendition of They All Laughed on here. It's just a record that I think had the potential to be better than it was. But I don't necessarily think the sonic decisions being made by the producer, who is credited as Jimmy Wisner on this record, I don't necessarily think they work. So I've Gotta Be Me is, I think the core of this record is quite nice and probably could have even boosted it a few spots higher on this list. But thanks to subpar production, I would say it will drop in about here, my number 43. At number 42, I don't know if this will be 100% controversial or not, but I do have the second Lady Gaga collaborative record, 2021's Love for Sale. This record, compared to the first one, Cheek to Cheek, which is kind of a hodgepodge of different songs, this one is a straight up Cole Porter tribute. It is nice. I think the arrangements here are solid enough for what they are. I just think, for reasons that frankly are probably pretty obvious, I don't think this record has the life or energy of the first one. It does sound like both artists are having a good time. I think Gaga sounds great pretty much overall, and Bennett sounds enthusiastic. I definitely think that the last couple of records of Bennett's career, though, you can start to feel the decline in ability a little bit. Just kind of, he's lost a little bit of that touch. And I also think that it doesn't necessarily help that this record is like a third of this record is like interchangeable solo performances by either Gaga or Bennett as well. So yeah, I don't know. It doesn't place Bennett in necessarily the most successful light at this point, given everything that he was dealing with at that point with his battle with Alzheimer's. But it's still fun. It's still, I think, a very, in many ways, an appropriate way, I think, to wrap up his career. Just a very kind of reverent album that puts him in at least a position where he's performing with someone who has a lot of respect for him. So while I don't think it's great, I do think that his career could have ended on a lot more manipulative and cynical of a note than it did. And so I'm grateful that, for what the final album was, that it ended up being this. Not a career highlight by any means, but Love for Sale, my number 42, it's decent, and I think worth checking out for what it is. At number 41, I have 2001's Playing With My Friends, Bennett Sings the Blues. As the title might suggest, this is Bennett doing blues numbers, which is not necessarily a great fit on paper, but works, I think, in large part because of who his duet partners are and how they work with him. I think his partners really push into his limits here, which is not something I think you can say about the other duets records quite as much. I I think the Stevie Wonder duet on Every Day I Have the Blues is as great as you would expect. I like the Ray Charles duet on Evening. I think his work with both Bonnie Raitt and especially Katie Lang here, I think, is excellent. Not everything is superb. I think the K-Star duet is, it's more meaningful than I think it is successful, perhaps. It's a point of respect, I suppose, given that she was very much close to the end of her life at that point. But again, you have other solid moments. The duet with Billy Joel, New York State of Mind, I think works really well. I really like the live versions that they do together. It's a fun album. It's an enjoyable album, and it's kind of fun at the end on the closing track, the title track, where they have all the collaborators kind of come together to, trade off vocals and guests and do guest spots. That's a pretty fun way of wrapping it up. It's an enjoyable record, enjoyable fun for what it is. Playing with My Friends, Bennett Sings the Blues, my number 41. Number 40, I have 1960s To My Wonderful One, another one of the Frank Duvall records that were called out before. Again, I think, this is a ballad-heavy record where a lot of the ballads sound a little bit kind of syrupy and lush and stiff. They're beautiful, but again, not necessarily everything, I think, works entirely for me. I think there's choral bits in tracks like Autumn Leaves that I think are just leave everything a little bit sterile and stiff. But I still think there are some strong songs. I like the rendition of September Song on here. I'm a Fool to Want You is really nice. April in Paris is good. It's a fairly nondescript Bennett ballads record from the early 60s. And I think, certainly at this point, Bennett's voice is quality enough to where even if this is not high-end Bennett material, I think it still serves its purpose quite nicely. And you could do a lot worse than this as far as ballad records from the early 60s go. So To My Wonderful One, not essential, but a good and quite pleasant listen. It's my number 40. At number 39, I have 1997's Tony Bennett on Holiday. As the name might suggest, this is a Billie Holiday tribute record, and there are a bunch of tribute records that Bennett does in the 90s, which I think for the most part are quite strong, and I would not say this is poor. However, I do think compared to the other ones from this era, it's a bit inconsistent. The playful tracks on here, the more upbeat tracks, are solely Bennett and piano on here from Ralph Sharon, and they don't necessarily have as much bite as some of the other tracks, and then as some of the other kind of upbeat tracks on other records. And then there are the ballads, which don't, I do think Bennett is a great ballad singer, but I think he occupies a very different realm from someone like Billie Holiday. I think Bennett is capable of sounding gorgeous and powerful in that sense, but I think Holiday's voice occupies just a very different realm. Whether you could say that's like, weather worn, or it just feels, she feels like someone who, when she sings about love and about heartbreak and about loss, it feels like she has really experienced it. And Bennett sort of seems like a really great kind of actor a lot of the time. And it's a good album across the board. And then you get to the final track, God Bless the Child, which is a manufactured duet with the original recording from Billy. Completely unnecessary. They try to make it fit where they have like Bennett's voice like filtered in a way to make it sound not obvious that he's recording it, 50 years later. But it doesn't work. Again, it's a little bit of that kind of Nat Cole, Natalie Cole, unforgettable type of thing, which I don't think, it doesn't necessarily sit super well with me. So it's good for the most part, but, compared to the other stuff that he was putting out in the 90s, which I do think are genuinely a very strong period for him, this doesn't quite reach up there for me. So Tony Bennett on Holiday comes in at my number 39. At number 38, I have 1967's Tony Makes It Happen. I have to shout out the arranger here, who has worked with Bennett on other stuff as well, Marion Evans, who, despite what his IMDb profile says, is still alive as of the recording of this video at the ripe old age of 98. Huge shout out to Marion Evans, who has done great work for a very long time. Always love to shout out folks who are still living as part of these videos. Yeah, good record for sure. Very decent record. Bennett's voice is really starting to kind of push itself at this point on the up-tempo numbers. Tracks like Don't Get Around Much Anymore and The Lady's in Love with You, he's really pushing to the upper extents of his range, which is cool. Like, you don't necessarily get to hear him kind of push that much, especially in this era. So that's an interesting switch up. I like the chords of kind of horns and saxes and the instrumental break of the track I Don't Know Why I Just Do. Old Devil Moon is really good. Yeah, I think it's a solid kind of, up-tempo number. The up-tempo moments here I think are really good. And yeah, I think this has a little bit of a distinctive character to it compared to some of the other late 60s records, which I think helps make it stand out a little bit. So Tony Makes It Happen, solid album. My number 38. At number 37, I have 2018's Love Is Here to Stay. This is a collection of George Gershwin tracks with Diana Krall duetting with Bennett and Bill Charlap's ensemble accompanying him. Now, this is the first record that was produced after Bennett's diagnosis with Alzheimer's. And I was saying this in the Love for Sale review as well. I think his vocal phrasing especially really drops noticeably in these final couple of records. I think there's still a power and still a sense of dynamism in his phrasing on the records before this that gets stripped away pretty heavily here. But I do think here the arrangements and the performers surrounding him really help him out. So I think, Krall I think is a great duet partner. I think she fits with him really nicely. The Charlap trio I think is excellent and rock solid, just like they were on the record before. They give him a hell of a foundation on tracks like So Wonderful and Fascinating Rhythm. They can't take that away from me. Yeah, just really, it's really pleasant. I think they work better within Bennett's limitations than I think the Gaga record from a few years later does. And yeah, it's just consistently pleasant, consistently really nice, and I appreciate that. Love Is Here to Stay, my number 37. Again, I do wish that Bennett and Diana Krall had maybe made a collaborative record before this, when Bennett was still of sounder mind. But it is, I think, still successful, especially given the parameters of how it was created. Love Is Here to Stay, my number 37. At number 36, I have 2008's A Swingin' Christmas. Almost 50 years after the first round of Tony Bennett Count Basie collaborations, we have another one here with Bennett and the Count Basie Big Band. Despite the terrible album cover, the awful Photoshop job on that cover, this is quite a solid Christmas album. A bunch of really solid arrangements on here. The Basie band sounds great. Even, old man 80-something Tony Bennett, I think, does a really agile job dancing on top of this stuff. Yeah, I think tracks like My Favorite Things, I love hearing him do Christmas Time Is Here. I think that's really nice. And then, moments like I Got My Love to Keep Me Warm, I think are really pleasant as well. Yeah, it's, late career Bennett in one of his more kind of upbeat and jovial moments, and I think that's always a plus. And again, I think the ensemble playing is terrific. So A Swingin' Christmas, quite good. It comes in at my number 36. At number 35, I have 1972's The Good Things in Life. This is Bennett's first album with Verve. Apparently all of this was recorded in a single day, according to the Sessionography online. And this would also become his last record to chart for almost 15 years until his comeback with Columbia. And God bless this thing. It's so essential to me that this record came out, because for the first time in ages, it feels like Bennett is actually engaged with the material. He feels completely disconnected on the Columbia records from this period, but this time he actually feels engaged. It feels like the arrangements here from Robert Farnon are actually pushing him a bit. The title track on this, I think, is his best recording in years up to this point. Love the dynamics in his vocals here. I like his renditions of like Oh Lady Be Good. Someone to Light Up My Life is strong. London by Night. Um, it's not a lost classic. It's not a career highlight by any means, but it was sorely needed after a stretch of records in the early 70s where I personally, after going through them, just felt so disconnected with what he was doing, so disinterested in this whole endeavor. This was the first record that actually made it seem like things were getting back on the rails a little bit. So much respect to the good things in life. My number 35. At number 34, I have 1961's My Heart Sings. This is another Ralph Burns arranged record, mixture of ballads and these kind of mellow swing numbers on here. Really pleasant. It all sits in this kind of like comfortable pocket. I think Bennett acquits himself well on this material. I like the vibraphone a lot on the track It Never Was You. I think that works really well. The track Loverman has these really present woodwind sections and these like prominent brass chords that really build on each other to create a very lush soundscape. I really like his rendition of like Don't Worry About Me. Stella by Starlight I think works well. Again, it's not necessarily a highlight of this period of Bennett's career, but again, it's a very high floor release, exceedingly pleasant, exceedingly well done. I have to respect the craftsmanship quite a bit. So My Heart Sings, really strong record. It comes in at my number 34. At number 33, I have 2002's A Wonderful World, the duet record between Bennett and K.D. Lang. And there's so many pieces here that seem like it would make for an absolutely superb record. I mean, one is K.D. Lang herself, terrific vocalist. Two, this is a tribute record to Louis Armstrong, who Bennett, has a lot of respect for, from both interviews and even just from the execution of this record in general. And then you also have T-Bone Burnett credited as a producer, which is really interesting. Now, I don't think this works as well as that compilation, that that list of ingredients would have you believe. I think it's a little bit sterile. I don't think Burnett's involvement really is anything more than like helping record like Lang's vocals and stuff like that. Like he does not, like his distinctive style that people associate him with is not present really here at all. But I do think it's the charisma of the vocalists that really pushes things through on here. KD herself especially, I think it's a couple of moments, great like solo moments on here. I love her vocals on That Lucky Old Sun. I think that works so well. I think, moments like La Vie en Rose, What a Wonderful World is a little bit cheesy, but I think they pull it off pretty well. Yeah, it really is just a moment where you have to get kind of sucked into the connection of the vocalists to really enjoy it. And luckily, I think I was. So I still end up appreciating this thing quite a bit and enjoying it a good bit. A Wonderful World, Tony Bennett, K.D. Lang collaboration. Really good stuff. It's my number 33. Check it out. Number 32, I have 1967's For Once in My Life. This is another Bennett record from this era where they kind of have like multiple different arrangers at his disposal, giving him material. Despite the title, which would maybe make you inclined to think that this is going to be a contemporary pop material record, this is still extremely standards focused. And there's some great recordings on here. Days of Love, I think, is one of his best ballads of this era. Really great vocals on that one. This is actually a fairly ballad heavy record. His interpretation of For Once in My Life is absolutely a slower kind of ornate version of it. The closing track, Keep Smiling at Trouble, I think is a good upbeat way to close the record. However, solid mid-tempo swing number on a record that just doesn't have too many of them. So yeah, executed quite well. Maybe not the strongest selection of material of his entire career necessarily, but I think it's quite good for what it is. For Once in My Life, solid record. It comes in at my number 32. At number 31, I have 1975's Life is Beautiful. This is the first record to be put out on Improv Records, Bennett's own label. Tori Zito on the arrangements here, and it's a solid collection of tunes. I think the arrangements are deeply rooted in strong jazz traditions, which is very much, the point of improv's existence was, rooting Bennett's music in the jazz traditions again. You do get some ancillary numbers like Milton Nascimento's Bridges, for instance, although I do think that's quite nice. I love the recording of Duke Ellington's Reflections. Just an excellent bit of balladry here. I think the cellos and the bass in this arrangement give this thing just a solid bit of weight. I like the rendition of Lost in the Stars on here. There'll be some changes made. There's a tempo change halfway through that I love. I think that is slick as hell. Yeah, I think it's, again, not a career highlight, but I think it certainly, this and the other kind of improv records paint a little bit of a what if portrait, which is what if improv had worked out financially. What would Bennett's career arc have looked like? And I think, if it had led to a lot of albums like this, I would not be complaining at all. Not top shelf Bennett material, but really solid. Life is Beautiful, my number 31. At number 30, I have 1960s Tony Bennett Sings a String of Harold Arlen. Glenn Osser on the arrangements here. Off the top of my head, I think this might be the only record of Bennett's that he arranged. I could be wrong. But I do really like what he adds here. Compared to like the Frank Duvall stuff that Bennett's been doing around this period of time, I think there's a bit of life here to this collection of ballads. Like the track For Every Man, There's a Woman, for instance. There's just a really nice light bounce to it, which I think works well with the material that Bennett is singing here as well. Tracks like When the Sun Comes Out and Over the Rainbow and It Was Written in the Stars, I've Got the World on a String, just really pleasant numbers. I think the mixing here as well feels brighter than on previous records, which I do appreciate. I think, again, not a core ballad record from late 50s, early 60s Bennett necessarily, but I do think compared to some of his other stuff, there's a little bit more that captures your ear. And, in that sense, I respect it quite a bit. Sings a String of Harold Arlen from 1960 comes in at my number 30. Really good stuff. Just really love hearing Bennett sing in kind of this context. Okay, number 28 and 29 are very, very interchangeable, a lot of the same strength, so I'm just going to talk about them now. I have 1976's Tony Bennett sings 10 Rodgers and Hart songs, and 1977's Tony Bennett sings more great Rodgers and Hart. Both of these are records from the Improv label, records that Bennett did with the cornet player Ruby Braff and guitarist George Barnes and their quartet, which actually had initially been recorded, I think, back in like 72, 73 or something like that. Really breezy tunes here overall. A lot of the songs on these records are like no longer than a couple of minutes long, but I just love hearing Bennett sing in this kind of intimate setting. The quartet themselves sound really fine. There's some great soloing on tracks like This Can't Be Love on the first record, or My Romance has a great muted cornet solo that's on the second record. Bennett's vocals at times sound really nice. I love Spring Is Here from the first one, one of his smokiest, breathiest vocals on record. The affect he does on there is not really one that he touches on very often, which I think is cool. Picking between the two, I think I enjoyed the first one slightly more, so that would probably be my 28, and the second one would be my 29, but the strengths are interchangeable. They're from the same batch of sessions. There's not really much argument for putting one above the other. It's just kind of whatever you're feeling in that particular moment. So Tony Bennett, the Rodgers and Hart records, my number 28 and 29, solid stuff. Number 27, I have 1987's Bennett Berlin. Irving Berlin tribute record, and, kind of the wild thing is that, Bennett is paying tribute to Berlin, and Berlin was still alive at that point, almost 100 years old. Quite a few all-star guests on this one. You have some great jazz musicians like Dexter Gordon, who adds some great tenor sax work on All of My Life. I think that's a good foil for Bennett's vocals on that one. His solo in White Christmas, I think, is stellar. Dizzy Gillespie adds some nice kind of bursts to the track the song is ended on here. I think the most successful guest spot is George Benson's guitar moment on Cheek to Cheek. I don't think Bennett himself is at peak form on this track. I think the key that they're playing the song in seems too low for him. But I think Benson is really, really strong on that one. When I Lost You, a cappella kind of interlude track in the middle, I think that's really stellar. It's ultimately pretty breezy. It's only half an hour long, and compared to, some of the stuff that Bennett is going to be doing later on, This is his second record after his Columbia comeback. It's a bit more trivial compared to what he's going to be doing later on, but it's still a lot of fun. Again, it goes by in kind of a snap, and yeah, I think it works really well for what it is. Bennett Berlin, my number 27. Really good stuff. Check it out. At number 26, I have 1964's Who Can I Turn To? You have the great George Saravo arranging this one. I love the title track. I think it's one of the best opening tracks of his entire catalog. Just the super dramatic and powerful recording. And that really becomes kind of the standard for this whole album. I think a lot of these orchestral arrangements are very massive and so full that you can pick out individual instruments very clearly in the mix. And maybe in that sense, the reliance on gravitas makes the record a bit repetitive, but it's still extremely pleasant. If you're looking for more mellower tracks, I think Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea and Got the Gate on the Golden Gate are both really, really strong. Yeah, I think at this point, this is really strong ballad material. We're entering this mid-60s phase at this point, or we're in the middle of this mid-60s phase, actually, where I think some of Bennett's best and most underrated material comes from. And Who Can I Turn To is, if maybe a step below that stuff, still extremely strong and worth checking out. My number 26, Who Can I Turn To? At number 25, I have 1995's Here's to the Ladies. This is, as the name might suggest, Bennett doing a tribute record to various female vocalists from the pop genre, such as Billie Holiday, Barbra Streisand, Julie London, Ella Fitzgerald, Dinah Washington, etc., etc. Really good stuff. You know, I love the focus on here. I love the respect that he's showing. It's not necessarily the best necessarily arrangements of the 90s stuff that he's been doing, but I still think it works quite well. I think Down in the Depths, which is a Mabel Mercer tribute, I think that one is a really brilliant swing number, one of his best from this period. You Showed Me the Way, that's the Ella Fitzgerald tribute, going all the way back to like her Chick Webb days back in the late 30s. Really moving tribute, especially given that, you know, she was still alive at the time, but was in quite poor health. Again, the God Bless the Child recording on here, I think that one works a lot better than the one he tries to do on the Billie Holiday tribute record. Yeah, it's not one of my absolute favorites from this sort of 90s renaissance of his, but I think very successful in what it's trying to do, and I have a lot of respect for it. Here's to the Ladies, my number 25. Good stuff. Definitely worth giving a listen, in my opinion. At number 24, I have the first Lady Gaga duet record, 2014's Cheek to Cheek. Gaga's rendition of The Lady is a Tramp from Duets 2 from 2011. That, as I said, was one of the best aspects of that whole record, so it's not surprising that a full-length collaboration between Gaga and Bennett was going to be successful. It's not surprising that she really adds a lot to the proceedings here and really pushes Bennett to put out like the most vim and verve and the most energy he's produced in a record in quite some time. And really, Gaga herself, I think, succeeds extremely well in this setting. I mean, she very much comes from that kind of theatrical background. She grew up being, you know, trained in jazz music. She's aware of this stuff quite deeply. So she works really well. Her performance of Lush Life, I think, is remarkable. Just an excellent vocal. In addition to this, because I think their collaborations like Cheek to Cheek, Nature Boy, I Won't Dance, It Don't Mean a Thing, I think are all excellent. But, you know, even just aside from the individual performances and the arrangements, I think this is also my favorite sounding Bennett record in a long time. There's a real like deadness to the sound here that makes it feel truly intimate, which might be related to, I think, what I've heard that they recorded, like they installed carpets in the studio when they were recording to try to, again, get that feel just from a kind of personal standpoint. I think you could hear it in the sound. And intimacy is not a word I would use to describe a lot of his 2000s work. I think it loses that sense of it in favor of these larger, kind of more ornate arrangements. So I love this back to basics approach. I think this informs a lot of the last records of his career. And yeah, I think this is extraordinarily successful for what it is. And even if it's not an absolute career highlight for Tony Bennett, nor would I say it's a Gaga career highlight, it's still extremely respectable, extremely well done. And at this point, we're getting to the point where, this is at least a borderline great album for me. We're into some really strong stuff here. So Cheek to Cheek is my number 24. Highly worth checking it out, I think. At number 23, I have 1999's Bennett Sings Ellington, Hot and Cool. Duke Ellington tribute record, which sounds amazing in theory, and for the most part works exceptionally well in execution. This is definitely an interestingly performed record, which I understand why. I think they are leaning into the fact that, this is very much a jazz artist who they are paying tribute to. And that means that this is not going to be just an easy listening record necessarily. You're going to get some more interesting moments, like the track Mood Indigo. There is some really aggressive, like, mute playing on here, muted, like, trumpet and trombone and stuff like that, that really clashes with the atmosphere of everything else. But to me, I think mostly in a good way. Again, because it kind of brings out the sort of more aggressive sides of jazz music and Ellington's compositional style, and I think that's super important. The record uses the track Take the A Train as kind of like a little intro section in quite a few spaces. It kind of reminds me of that Elvis album, Elvis Country, in that sense. It's a little bit odd. I feel like it's a bit inconsistently used, perhaps. Like they only do it for certain songs, not for every single track, but it's an interesting decision, so I respect the idea. I love the whispered vocals and Sophisticated Lady, along with the violin solo on that one. There's also just kind of a higher percentage of instrumentals and extended instrumental sections on this record. Again, just going back to who Ellington was as a composer, I think this record really seems to understand that and try to understand that. And it works really, really well. Maybe Bennett takes a bit more of a backseat compared to other records from the 90s, but I think it works, again, really well for what it is. Bennett Sings Ellington, Hot and Cool, my number 23. Number 22, I have 1964's The Many Moods of Tony. Another record where Bennett is working with kind of a team of arrangers here. And I think the sort of diversity in ideas here helps this record succeed rather nicely. It does ultimately work, I think, as a benefit to several of these mid-60s albums where he's doing this. I think the Taste of Honey arrangement is nice, a little bit kind of, traditional / stale in some ways, but nice for what it is. I think Soon It's Gonna Rain has a really great mystique to the arrangement, really great piano from Ralph Sharon on there. Chico Hamilton's drums on the track Caravan, I think, are really solid. Hamilton makes a few great appearances on Tony Bennett albums. It's a nice, diverse enough listen to where it's not just a collection of ballads, but it all feels really well executed. The record sounds great. Really strong mid-60s effort from Tony here. The Many Moods of Tony, my number 22. Number 21, I have 1958's Long Ago and Far Away. This is mostly a collection of ballads. Ralph Sharon, I think Sharon is the arranger on here. Frank Duvall is the conductor. And it's meant to evoke the feel of a saloon record, I suppose, very much like, stuff that Sinatra was doing and even Nat King Cole was doing as well. I don't think it quite gets there. I think maybe it's that I don't think the arrangements necessarily captured the feel of like a classic Nelson Riddle or Gordon Jenkins thing. Maybe it's just that I think the depths of what someone like Sinatra was able to do with their vocals, I don't think Bennett necessarily, I don't think he shares those same strengths. But it still, I think, works this really, really well for the most part. I really like how the title track utilizes harpsichords in a really interesting way. It almost gives it a vague proto-Baroque pop feel, like almost accidentally pointing towards the direction that pop music would go down later on. I think that's interesting. Love the saxophones and Blue Moon, just absolutely searing stuff. Really great overall. It's a strong collection of songs. It really is a strong collection of recordings. And even if I don't think it's quite as successful with what it's going for as it wants to be, I don't think. I still think this puts Bennett in as good of a position to succeed from a ballad standpoint as a lot of his records have, which is worthy of praise in and of itself. So Long Ago and Far Away, my number 21, quite good stuff. Check it out. At number 20, I have 1986's The Art of Excellence. This is the comeback record with Columbia after almost 15 years of not being signed to the label. And it's a really solid affair, really, really, really strong way of kind of picking back up. I mean, he hadn't recorded a studio album at this point in almost a decade as well. And, you know, it's right in this like nice pocket of you have some ballad numbers, you have some mid-tempo swing numbers. It's really just there to kind of give you exposure to Bennett in his strengths and his excellence, if you will. And it works quite well for that. The track So Many Stars, I think, is absolutely beautiful on here. Bennett kind of floats through his vocals with some really great piano riffs from Ralph Sharon and the bass line from Paul Angosh, giving him just really good floor to play on. Really, again, just serves his strengths as a vocalist and proves those strengths really nicely. You have a Ray Charles duet here in the track Everybody Has the Blues, which is a lot of fun. And I think if there's one song that maybe you can point to as the start of Bennett being perceived as this like primo duets performer, then I think this track might be it. Certainly, you know, he would do other duets in the late 80s and early 90s and such, but this is definitely a sharp one. And yeah, they both are just clearly having a lot of fun with it, which is really great. Yeah, really strong album overall. Really solid arrangements. You know, solid kind of trio core backing with you know lush kind of strings and things like that at points as well. Yeah, really good comeback piece. And definitely up there with his career highlights. I think certainly The Art of Excellence is my number 20. At number 19, I have 2015's The Silver Lining, the songs of Jerome Kern. You know, I wasn't really expecting to like a super late career Tony Bennett album as much as I did this one, but holy shit, this is good. Bill Charlap is the collaborator on here, the pianist. He's playing with his kind of trio behind him. And I just think this setting works so well. Even if Bennett's voice maybe at this point is not necessarily the type that can front a full orchestra and sound completely like natural, I think in front of a trio, he sounds excellent. And even at almost 90 years old, you can still hear him push himself beyond what should be reasonable for anybody to do, let alone an almost 90-year-old man. I Won't Dance is excellent. All the Things You Are is excellent. The Song Is You. I can't believe the sustain he can put on that ending note on Yesterday's at that age. It's absolutely remarkable, and one of the last moments in his career that like genuinely gave me goosebumps from a vocal perspective. Just unreal what he can do. And you know, again, the two records that he puts out after this one, I think you can hear the vocal phrasing start to fall off fairly significantly. So in some ways, this is kind of the last hurrah of Bennett as this like upper echelon jazz vocalist. And in that sense, I think this stands as one of the most underrated Tony Bennett records and one of the most kind of, you know, one of the ones that I think if you're familiar with some of the popular ones from this ranking, you should definitely rush to check this one out. Great stuff. The Silver Lining, Jerome Kern tribute record. It's my number 19. At number 18, I have 1959's Hometown, My Town. This is interesting record. It's this kind of pseudo-conceptual piece about New York City that seems to be kind of symbolic of like isolation within the big city. I don't think the concept works. Like, I don't think the concept holds the entire time. I think it kind of falls apart in the second half. But it works really nice for what it's trying to do. I think Penthouse Serenade is excellent. That entire first side has these like longer tracks on it, like 6 to 7 minutes long, that I think really work well as an interpretive challenge for Tony. It feels like he's really working to convey the feelings of these songs in a conscious way that you don't think about as much in some of his other stuff. And I think that's interesting. His rendition of I Cover the Waterfront on here is superb. I think it's one of his best 50s ballads and an arrangement that's very evocative of some of the very best kind of moments from this era across all different crooners. Definitely a huge highlight for him for sure. And a really strong album overall, I think. Again, even if maybe the high concept of it doesn't work as well as it maybe intends to, I think it still puts him in a great position to succeed. And I think that's what you want ultimately from a Tony Bennett record when all's said and done. So Hometown, My Town. It's my number 18. At number 17, I have 1963's I Wanna Be Around. This is another really solid ballads record, mixing these kind of lusher arrangements with more kind of stripped back ones. We're talking about kind of the stripped back pieces. I think Until I Met You is a really great kind of intimate jazz quartet number. Again, I love it when Bennett gets into that setting. You'll see more examples of that later on. So that works really well. It Was Me, I think, really emphasizes that intimacy with Bennett's vocals being very like close mic'd and instruments like flute and acoustic guitar being very present as well. Bossa Nova comes in with the track Quiet Nights of Quiet Stars, or Corcovado, by Antonio Carlos Jobim. I think that works really nicely. He doesn't do Bossa Nova a whole lot in his career, but I think he's pretty successful when he does. Yeah, one of the stronger mid-60s ballads records, I think, overall from Tony. Works really well for what it is. And yeah, not much more to be said about it. I Want to Be Around, my number 17. Really strong stuff. Check it out. At number 16, I have 1993's Steppin' Out. This is very much in the vein of Perfectly Frank that came out right before this. Now the focus here is, instead of Frank Sinatra tribute songs, now this is Fred Astaire tracks. And yeah, I think this is almost a perfect matchup of material and singer here. There's a lot of humor and triviality to these tunes, a lot of which are like Gershwin or Irving Berlin songs. It plays so well for Bennett. And I think he just dances around these tracks with the trio accompaniment behind him just so well. It's not quite the statement record that the Sinatra album is, at least to my ears, but it's fun as hell. I mean, Top Hat, White Tie, and Tails, they all laughed. Nice Work If You Can Get It, That's Entertainment. I just think perfect Bennett vehicles for expressing, again, that more kind of jovial side of himself. And again, the arrangements just do so well to give him that foundation to shine that it's great. Steppin' Out, number 16, great Fred Astaire tribute album, really worth checking out. Number 15 is one of the more interesting records, I think, on this list, just one of the more unique ones, certainly. 1957's The Beat of My Heart. The whole focus with this record is on these songs with like heavy percussive arrangements, often with like kind of tempo switches or feel switches midway through. And the drum lineup that they get to kind of push through this whole thing is a who's who of major drum names. I mean, you have Art Blakey on here, Philly Joe Jones is on here, Chico Hamilton is on here. It works immensely well. Love for Sale is definitely one, I think, of the quirkier arrangements of the song that I've heard. Sabu on the percussion does a really great job adding kind of this like I don't know, Congo or bongo background that really just gives it a frenetic feel. The track Lazy Afternoon, not necessarily as percussion focused, but I really love the impressionist piano trills on there, and the guitars I think are really beautiful. I'm not enamored by the arrangements always. Like the track Blues in the Night is just not built for a singer like Bennett. It's played up pretty playfully. It sounds odd. I think he does a better job of it in the 2001 record when he re-records it. But overall, yeah, I think it's a sharp bit of playing. Again, this is Bennett working with Ralph Sharon now, who's pushing him towards a more jazz-focused direction. And I think you can really hear that on here. And it works really well for the most part. The Beat of My Heart is my number 15. It's great. Check it out. At number 14, I have 1990's Astoria, Portrait of the Artist. We're getting into now some kind of ambitious material. This seems to be delving into Bennett's artistic roots a bit. A lot of tracks on here that seem to be, again, delving into like his own inspirations. Some of these he's recorded previously as well. And, you know, so When Do the Bells Ring for Me, I think is superb. A Little Street Where Old Friends Meet, I think is quite fun. Speak Low is a really nice slower number. Body and Soul works well. He re-records The Boulevard of Broken Dreams, his first song with Columbia on here. It feels career spanning. And, you know, you mix that with like, you know, again, in some ways this emphasis on, you know, a more intimate core with still some lusher moments on here. I think it works really well. And I think especially when you put it in context with like how his career arc developed, and you understand, how close to the brink he was of kind of losing it all. There's a power to this one that I think, kind of goes a little bit unspoken, but I think it's there. And yeah, I think it's definitely a late career highlight for me. Absolutely. And quite worth checking out. Yeah. Astoria, Portrait of the Artist. It's my number 14. Oh, okay. So my number 13 is certainly going to be the most controversial part of this whole list if you've made it this far. But I kind of warned you in the intro that something like this could potentially happen. I do have at number 13, 1962's I Left My Heart in San Francisco. By far, I think the best known Tony Bennett record, in large part just because it happens to be titled after his most famous song. As I said, the fact about whether or not this record should count, I think, is dubious because a lot of these tracks were already released singles, a few songs taken from previous records like Love for Sale and the aforementioned The Beat of My Heart, Taking a Chance on Love from the In Person record, one of the Count Basie efforts. There's not a whole lot of completely brand new material on here. But as far as the strengths of this go, I mean, those two tracks that I mentioned I think are great. As far as I Left My Heart in San Francisco goes, the title track, there's a good reason that it's his best known song. I think it's just this stunning ode to the West Coast that just builds up to this magnificent ending. Really, there's so many tracks written about the East Coast. I feel like that the West Coast gets a little bit shafted in comparison, certainly when you think about this era. So for Bennett to center it in this track, not that he wrote it, but for this recording to center the West Coast as it does, I think it's a statement, I suppose. And it's really successful, really great performance. Now, the thing is, the track after it, Once Upon a Time, which was the single of which the title track was the B-side of, I think it's just as strong, if not even a little bit better. I just love the conviction with which he sings the titular line on that track. It's just absolutely excellent. It's not an across-the-board elite collection, in my opinion. I actually think the second side of this is noticeably weaker. I don't really like Candy Kisses all that much. So you're really clinging to this for the highlights, which granted are career highlights for Bennett, 100%. But yeah, I think it's a little bit inconsistent. Certainly sonically at points, I think it's a bit inconsistent. And, but yeah, man, when it hits, and that's undeniable. And look at it like this, even if you love I Left My Heart in San Francisco, and I do think it's a great record, just understand that there are a dozen other Tony Bennett albums that I think are just as worthwhile of listens, if not even more so, and that you should consider exploring if you really like this one. I Left My Heart in San Francisco, his most famous album. It comes in at my number 13. At number 12, I have 1977's Together Again. This is the second and final record he did with Bill Evans. Perhaps you might describe this as like a mellower version of the first Bill Evans album. I think you get to hear Evans' more elegant side on tracks like A Child Is Born, where his piano is just really beautiful and pristine, and Bennett's vocals kind of soar above them with this really great sense of dynamics. There's some just really prominent crescendos and decrescendos here. I think the Bennett Bill Evans stuff is just spectacular across the board. I think it's such a great mixture of vocalist and not accompanist, because I think Evans is clearly a centerpiece in these records and gets plenty of great moments to shine as a soloist. It's a great mixture of collaborators is the big thing. Maybe September, I think, is terrific. You Must Believe in Spring is excellent. It's such a great fusion, and it's interesting. I've not heard Bill Evans' entire discography. I will at some point, but I know from my understanding, this is quite late career Bill Evans, stuff before things kind of fell apart due to his struggles with drug addiction. So knowing where Evans was in his career, and knowing where Bennett was in his career, where he's also struggling with addiction, and knowing how it ended for the both of them, I think makes these two albums really profound and really powerful in hindsight. And so yeah, the fact that this one is the latter of the two, even if I don't like it quite as much, I think, yeah, it just gives it a real weight. It gives it a bit of presence. But But that said, you don't have to dwell on that either. You can just enjoy the fact that it's just a damn good collaboration. It's just really, really successful in that way. Together again, Bill Evans, Tony Bennett, my number 12. Number 11, I have 1964's When Lights Are Low. One of the most intimate records that Bennett had done to this point. This is Bennett singing with a trio. But Ralph Sharon's arrangements on here also, I think, give this record a sense of breadth as well. So like this doesn't feel like completely just like quiet and soft. Like there's definitely a bit more scope here as well. And Bennett matches the moment so well here. His vocals on this record are absolutely terrific. Some of his best. On Green Dolphin Street, there's some great trills on that one that I think are just absolutely stellar. One of the career highlights certainly for me. Oh You Crazy Moon has one of his best lower register vocals in this era, which pairs well with the kind of bluesier side of his voice that he's also exploring. I think it's one of the more successful attempts of him delving into that side of things. Ain't Misbehavin', Speak Low, It Had to Be You, I think are all excellent moments as well. Just again, going back to the fact that I think Bennett in intimate settings just works really, really well. And I think that's where you start to see some of the more sophisticated sides of his delivery and his ability as an interpreter of song. And this demonstrates it as well as anything, really. So super underrated record, excellent stuff, really worth checking out. When Lights Are Low is my number 11. All right, we're in the top 10 finally. And at number 10, I have the record that, for the purposes of this video is technically his debut album, 1955's Cloud 7. Another intimate record, going back to this is Bennett with a jazz quartet here. Chuck Wayne kind of steering things. He was kind of Bennett's main musical arranger for a couple of years there. And yeah, I just think this quartet sound, especially with the prominent guitars, is extremely unique for his career. Again, when we talk about intimate Bennett after this, we were talking about piano-focused arrangements. There's no piano here. It's Wayne's, or not too much piano. A couple of songs have him. But, this is guitar-focused stuff. And yeah, it works super well. Tracks like My Baby Just Cares for Me and the closing track, Darn That Dream, I think are really lovely and really tender. I love the kind of spunk of the rendition of Old Devil Moon on here. I think that's excellent. Some great guitar work on that one. And, you compare this to the early Columbia singles where it's very, again, kind of, suit and tie, very regal, very stiff. And this just has so much life, and you really get to hear Bennett's strength as a jazz singer. And you hear that really come to life here, which I really love. So Cloud 7, really strong album from 55, really sharp way to bring Bennett certainly into the LP era, if nothing else. And it's my number 10. Great stuff. Check it out. At number 9, I have 1968's Snowfall, the Tony Bennett Christmas album. Really, really cozy Christmas record. I know people who think that this might be their favorite Tony Bennett album, and I don't agree, obviously, but I see where they're coming from. I think the arrangements here by Robert Farnon are a step above much of what Bennett was singing with and performing with around this era. And again, having this like thematic center of winter and Christmas in general really helps. You have your traditional Christmas songs like, the Christmas song, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, White Christmas, etc. But you also have a couple of newer tracks, like the opening track, Snowfall, which I think is beautiful. Christmas Land is really nice as well. I like the medleys that incorporate jazz standards, like, the medley of I Love the Winter Weather, and then I've Got My Love to Keep Me Warm. I think that's really clever. And yeah, and even the holiday standards that people know, I think are also really nice. The up-tempo version of Winter Wonderland here, I think is really, really great. So I think certainly, it's an extremely successful Christmas album, and one that over time I think has gotten more attention as well. I think it has been historically maybe a bit overlooked compared to some of his contemporaries like your Andy Williams and your Nat King Coles and so on and so forth. But this one, it really is up there with the best of the Christmas records, I think. I'm glad to see it finally getting its due a little bit. Snowfall from 1968. It's my number 9. At number 8, I have 1961's Tony Sings for Two. Going back to the intimate thing, and this is almost as intimate as it gets without it just being Tony singing without accompaniment. Ralph Sharon on the piano is it. That is the only accompaniment he has throughout the whole record, and it's lovely. Again, it's striking because, with that intimacy comes vulnerability, and a lesser vocalist would probably, quiver and quake in this type of setting, but Bennett is not a lesser vocalist. He's one of the best of his era, and it really shows here. I really like Nobody's Heart Belongs to Me on here. It's a really good use of his lower register, such as it is. Again, when we talk about his lower register, it's always relative. He's very much a higher placed kind of tenor vocalist. But when he gets down into that lower register, it does sound pretty, it sounds nice. It sounds kind of warm and husky. I love the rendition of My Funny Valentine on here. It's an excellent juxtaposition of how the piano and the vocals are able to push each other into higher registers effectively. Like as Sharon is moving up the scale, his chords are kind of using different inversions to move up the neck of the piano. And Bennett's kind of pushing himself up there as well. It's so evocative and it works so fucking well. Happiness is a Thing Called Joe is another one kind of like that. Bennett almost seems to oversing that track, but it doesn't bother me. I'm enamored by the combination here. I can't imagine what it would be like to see this kind of a duo live as well. Again, I think it would just, you could probably hear a pin drop in the crowd during these types of songs. So Tony Sings for Two. Yeah, it's as intimate as he gets, and it's stellar. What can you say? My number 8. Check it out. At number 7, I have my favorite late career Tony Bennett record, 1992's Perfectly Frank. Compared to the previous albums, we are fully in the CD era at this point. We are now at a 73-minute long record, 24 songs, all tributes to Frank Sinatra. And in that sense, this could very easily have gone poorly, just considering its length. But thankfully, it's pure joy. Again, we're focusing on the trio accompaniment here now. So again, we're stripping things back. It shows just how much Tony thrives in these intimate environments. And, oh man, his vocals on here are the best he's done in quite a long time. Like the moment I have cited is Here's That Rainy Day, where there's these really amazing wordless ahs that he's doing at points. Just absolutely stunning. And don't get me wrong, yeah, the ballads on here are remarkably good. But then songs like Day In, Day Out, I think, are still good signs of Bennett's ability to swing as well. There's still some really great kind of, up-tempo numbers, as it were. And I think also, these are songs that, in many cases Bennett has recorded before, has performed before. So he has a strong connection to this material. I think it helps that he and Sinatra were genuinely quite good friends as well. So this feels not even necessarily like Bennett is paying tribute to an idol of his or someone that he just admires. This also feels like he is paying tribute to a friend. And maybe that's me just kind of reading into it too much with context, but I just think this works so well. This is such a strong testament to Bennett's abilities as a performer, a really great sentiment. And this, I think this record too, if you look at his career trajectory, is what solidifies Bennett from a studio album standpoint anyways as being kind of there to stay. It starts this string of 90s records that are just like a lock for getting, at least one Grammy Award apiece and that sort of thing. And yeah, it's stellar. Again, Perfectly Frank, number 7, great stuff. Check it out. At number 6, I have 1959's Strike Up the Band, which is also known as Basie Swings, Bennett Sings. This is one of 2 records that Bennett put out with the Count Basie Orchestra around this time. This was recorded a week after the other one, In Person. In Person was put out on Bennett's label, Columbia. This record was put out on Roulette, Basie's label. Yeah, really great, fresh collection of material. The strengths of these 2 albums are pretty much identical. The Basie Orchestra is dynamite. No matter where you go, no matter who you talk to, they're always spectacular. And Bennett just glides over these arrangements just superbly. Again, if we've been talking about Bennett in an intimate setting for a very long time, and that's so there's so much strength to hearing him in that setting. But man, when he's above this, like in front of this larger jazz ensemble like this, I mean, it's remarkable hearing what he's able to do. It's just so good. With Plenty of Money in You and Anything Goes, I think are really, really sharp swing numbers on here. Again, it's also really short. Like hardly any of these numbers are above like 3 minutes in length. Poor Little Rich Girl has this really kind of great buildup at the end that I love quite a bit. It's just, I don't know. I mean, hearing Bennett just, and, really his prime vocally, I think at this point, certainly as far as like dexterity and what he's able to do with his voice, it's a thrill to behold. And as I said, I mean, really this record and the other one are very, very close quality wise. Really sharp material, great arrangements, great performances. Strike Up the Band or Basie Swings Bennett Sings. It's my number 6. Great stuff. Check it out. At number 5, I have 1965's If I Ruled the World, Songs for the Jet Set. This is the first record that Bennett did with Don Costa on the arrangements, and clearly one of his best, I think. I mean, just a great, certainly one of the best collections of arrangements he's ever been given. Just a great showcase of so many sides of his ability and his versatility as a vocalist. And Costa, who really, in these arrangements relies heavily on strings, just gives these long kind of sustained notes that'll give Bennett this like padding to do his thing without kind of fighting for air, I suppose. It's not like the late 60s records where he's kind of fighting the arrangements and fighting the production to get a word in edgewise. It fits perfectly here. I talked about Fly Me to the Moon when talking about the MTV Unplugged performance. I adore this version. I mean, it's kind of the anti-Sinatra version, where Sinatra, who of course recorded his famous rendition with Count Basie, very kind of upbeat and snappy. In this case, it's just very blissful and peaceful. Bennett's version is. And I love how Bennett's vocals and the saxophone by Al Cohn just bounce off each other so well in a tender way. And even the backing vocals, which I've had gripes about in past records, I think they work here with everything else. Couple of Jobim songs on here. I think they are lovely. Samba do Avião, Song of the Jet, and then How Insensitive. I think both of those work really nicely. Sweet Lorraine is a Nat King Cole tribute that I think is really charming. It shows off many sides of Bennett's abilities as a vocalist, and in that sense is definitely a career highlight and something that even could potentially be a contender for number 1, honestly. I mean, all of these top kind of 6 to 7 records, I think, could be contenders for my favorite at any given point. But for right now, it comes in at my number 5. If I Ruled the World, Songs for the Jet Set. Excellent stuff. At number 4, I have 1975's The Tony Bennett, Bill Evans Album. So I mentioned already kind of the success of Bennett and Evans working together as a duo. But really just putting it in context, right? I mean, this is coming after just a stretch of oftentimes just really mediocre to sometimes just miserable Bennett albums. And in this record, this is the most engaged that Bennett has sounded in a long time. And again, without knowing the full context, from what I understand, the same could be said for Evans as well. Compared to the second one of the records, I think this is a more balanced affair where Bennett and Evans really are bouncing off of each other. The track When in Rome, I think, is really excellent. Like, I think you hear Bennett's playful side bringing out the same in Evans, and it bounces around. It's so fun. Really love that one. My Foolish Heart has a great solo to it. There's some really great bluesier runs in there that I really like. The Touch of Your Lips is excellent. Interesting to hear Waltz for Debbie, one of Evans' most famous tracks with lyrics. I think that's kind of a nice touch. Really like that. Evans, I mean, so much could be said about his strengths as a performer, and I'm sure I will have plenty to say about them when he eventually gets a video. But, when we hear Bill Evans, oftentimes I think of these kind of lusher moments, these, really romantic, almost impressionist influenced pieces. But here he's really showing kind of all sides of what he can do, and I think that's just really superb, and Bennett matches him in every conceivable way. It's a perfect marriage of performers. It's the best of the improv records, I think. And it's kind of a shame, I mean, it shows that it is really a shame that improv didn't last longer than it did because, who knows what these types of collaborations could have led to long term. I don't know. But yeah, Tony Bennett, Bill Evans album, 1975, my number 4, superb stuff. Check it out. At number 3, I have 1959's In Person. This was initially meant to be a live recording of a concert performance. They ended up deciding to re-record it in the studio. And let me tell you, thank God for the CD reissue, which is what you hear on streaming. The original LP had dubbed applause in after all the songs, which definitely, I think, puts a damper onto things, makes everything feel fake. It never feels organic. The CD reissue strips that away entirely, which I think is really, really nice. A lot of these tracks are re-recordings of songs that Bennett had already recorded, which makes it a bit repetitive, arguably. But then you have the Count Basie Orchestra backing him, which gives this thing so much life, and I think Bennett absolutely shines as a result. Again, I already talked about the Basie Orchestra and the Strike Up the Band review. The arrangements are, comparably excellent. The performances are comparably excellent. And it just puts Bennett in a place where he does feel like he is pushed to show off the most, vibrant and most powerful sides of his voice. And he just succeeds with flying colors. Taking a Chance on Love, which is a track that Bennett had already recorded a couple of years earlier on his album Tony. I think it's uplifted even more with the Basie arrangement, and his vocals on here are so fucking powerful. I mean, when he hits that like high C towards the end, it's just, it's really, really sharp stuff. One of the best upbeat numbers that he ever tracked. Lullaby at Broadway, really brilliant. Also love how the melody kind of glides over the arrangement here. Another one that I think he did live pretty frequently afterwards. It's still not a flawless album. The track Old Man River at the end, which closes it, like, all respect to Candido Camaro, all respect to the bongos as an instrument. I don't necessarily think I needed to hear Old Man River with a 2-minute long bongo solo, no matter how technically great it is. But that's a small gripe in what is otherwise just a really fantastic album, and really an album that makes you wonder like how good the live performance would have sounded to an audience. Terrific arrangements, outstanding vocals, some of the best of his career in both aspects, and yeah, in that sense, definitely a career highlight. In Person, Tony Bennett, number 3, excellent stuff, check it out. At number 2, I have 1957's Tony. Gil Evans on the arrangements here. I believe this is the only record that Evans did arrangements for across the board. And yeah, it works exceptionally well. A terrific match of performer and arranger, actually. I think the ballads and the upbeat numbers here are both really, really strong. Very dramatic arrangements here, very theatrical. The upbeat numbers on here, like Taking a Chance on Love, which I just mentioned, and I Can't Give You Anything But Love, are just stellar. Fucking stellar. Top shelf stuff. The arrangements are extraordinary, and Bennett's voice is pushed to the brink of what it's been asked to do in these early recordings here. And he, again, succeeds with flying colors. It doesn't ever sound like a struggle when he's singing those high sustained notes, when he's, engaging with his like bel canto operatic techniques a little bit on some of these tracks. Like the closing song, Without a Song, has that really great kind of trill towards the end, which I think is extraordinary. His re-recording of The Boulevard of Broken Dreams, which was one of the first songs he recorded with Columbia, is masterful. I think so huge improvement, in my opinion. Just a masterful bit of phrasing on that one. Just superb. The whole record is superb stuff, top shelf kind of, or close to top shelf anyways, like vocal jazz from this era, vocal pop from this era. Again, we're talking about maximalist arrangements here that Bennett is singing over, and again, it just proves it does not matter what type of arrangement he's given. It could be, literally just a single piano underneath him, or it could be an entire orchestra like this. Does not matter. Bennett will succeed anyways, because that's how unique of a vocalist he was. I don't think it's a stretch to say from a technical standpoint, Bennett was the best of the crooners, of the pop singers of this era in general, at least of the male pop singers. I think if you get to female singers, I think Ella will have a lot to say about that. But yeah, remarkable stuff. Extraordinary performances. Great album. Tony, my number 2. And at number 1, I have 1966's The Movie Song Album. Sort of an unassuming record if you're going off of name alone, but then you look at a couple things. First, you look at Tony Bennett's assessment himself. It appears I'm in lockstep with him because Bennett has called this his favorite record that he's ever recorded. And then you look at the arrangers on here. Johnny Mandel, excellent. Neil Hefti, of course, very important in the Count Basie side of things, writing a lot of the charts for that band. And the great Quincy Jones credited as an arranger on here as well. And you realize just how much is going into this record. And then as you listen to it, you start to understand why Bennett himself considered this a high watermark of his career. It's really, it's a ballad heavy record. There's not a whole ton of upbeat tracks. But holy cow, the arrangements, I think, just dig into these tracks super effectively. The tracks Emily and The Pawnbroker back to back are just two phenomenal songs. The Pawnbroker especially, I think, is kind of desolate as far as Bennett tracks go. And yet not the best 1-2 sequence. I think The Shadow of Your Smile into Smile is just superb. Just really, really, again, great pairing of tracks here. Samba de Orfeu, another bossa nova track here. I think it's his best one to date. And again, the record barely even gets into upbeat territory at all. It's not really even until the final track that you get it, which is the trolley song for Meet Me in St. Louis. And that song jams hard. I mean, it's a great kind of bit of upbeat arrangement on here. I think Bennett sounds extraordinary. His vocal performances are remarkable on this. And I think, to me, this is one of the best and most diverse collections of arrangements in his career, if not the absolute best. And I think that's what helps this record succeed. The arrangements here from everybody really balance the concepts of intricacy, of diversity, and intensity really, really well. And they just always manage to put Bennett in super strong positions. So when you take that combination of extraordinary collaborations and extraordinary arrangements, as well as just the songs themselves, which is just a really, really strong collection of material, Bennett's right at home. And it's evocative, it's profound, it's oftentimes heavy and dark, but the light moments are really great too. It's mid-60s Bennett has so many actually really strong albums that I think tend to get overlooked, especially in the wake of something like I Left My Heart in San Francisco. And again, this is one of the most unassuming of the bunch for so many reasons, but it's actually pretty exceptional. The Movie Song Album, my number 1 Tony Bennett record. Really wasn't expecting it going in, but yeah, this one floored me pretty much. So highly worth checking out, as well as a lot of the others on this list. Man, what a great top part of the discography. Some rough moments overall, but the best Tony Bennett stuff is still like really excellent top shelf stuff. Okay, that is it. We have made it to the end of this Tony Bennett ranking video. Thank you for watching to the end if you did. I'm very curious to know if you've heard any of these albums, what your favorites are, what your impressions are of Tony Bennett in general, what your impressions are. I am very curious to know that. Let me know some of your favorite songs of his. Great artist. I think really important legacy. Even if this was maybe some of the lower moments of some of the discographies that I've done in the past, I think the higher portions of this ranking really kind of balance it out in an appropriate way. So great stuff. With that, I want to say thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come, more discography dives are to come, and etc. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time, right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.